And welcome to live streaming coverage of the Democratic National Convention. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates, and you are watching Atlanta News First Plus wherever you get us, including on YouTube. It's good to be here. And we're doing this every day during the convention, just like we did the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. We're doing exactly the same coverage plan, and we're obviously dedicating the time this time to the Democrats, and of course we gave equal time to the Republicans with almost identical coverage back then. There was a very different convention in Milwaukee. Of course, it came right after the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump, and you had a lot of drama leading up to what, by all accounts, was a very well-run convention. And we're starting to get the same feedback from the first night of the convention in Chicago with the Democrats. What a night it was last night. Certainly a victory lap for President Joe Biden, but it was also the passing of the torch. You know, the news is using the phrase passing the torch so much that you can expect John Oliver to have a montage of local news anchors saying passing the torch when he does Last Week Tonight this weekend on HBO, because that's really what it was. It was a passing of the torch, not just from one president to a potential future president, but also from one generation to another. Age has been such an issue in this race. It certainly was before Joe Biden dropped out, and he actually embraced that. It was very interesting. At one point, Joe Biden said that he was too young when he was elected to the Senate, which is actually true. He was 29 and had to wait to turn 30 to be sworn in as a senator. And then he said, I'm now too old to be president. And he sort of bookended his political career by saying he was once thought of as too young. He was legally too young, and now he's thought of as too old. But he did embrace that, and he said that it was basically a life of service. We saw a very strong Joe Biden. What a contrast from the president we saw during the debate with Donald Trump, the debate that essentially ended Joe Biden's political career. That debate performance, sent shockwaves through the Democratic Party and ultimately led to pressure on the president to not run for re-election. But last night he was very forceful. It was, of course, very well received in that room because you had a room full of Joe Biden fans. But by all accounts, this was the Joe Biden that Joe Biden wished had shown up to the debate against Donald Trump. We may be having a very different discussion if that had occurred. But he is stepping aside, not obviously as president, but in terms of running for re-election. He's not the party's nominee. The party's nominee would be speaking normally on Thursday, but we had Joe Biden speaking on the first night of the convention. And you also saw Kamala Harris, which again is unusual. I'd say unusual, but Donald Trump also showed up early on in the Republican National Convention and was there every day. It used to be tradition that the nominee, if pre-selected before the convention, wouldn't show up until Thursday. They were sort of, watching from afar. And usually the nominee isn't even in the city where the convention is held until the very last day of the convention. It's sort of like, Caesar crossing the Rubicon and entering Rome victorious. That has now changed because the two current nominees showed up at the beginning of their conventions and actually addressed the convention. So you had Kamala Harris last night actually addressing the convention, but what did she say? It was all about celebrating Joe Biden. And so this is that needle we talked about yesterday that Kamala Harris has to thread in terms of essentially taking credit for any successes of which she was a part in the Biden administration, at the same time saying, no, I'm a new, fresh candidate. I'm the new generation. I'm about tomorrow, not yesterday. But last night you had Hillary Clinton addressing the convention, and that also, harkens back to her time when she was the nominee. So you've got all of this sort of party stalwarts. It's the old DNC came out. To borrow a term, not the grand old party Republicans, but the grand old party Democrats coming out and quite literally embracing Kamala Harris as their nominee. And you sort of had her anointed by all of these big names in Democratic politics. That's great news for the base. The base loves all of these candidates, past presidents and current president. But does this bring in those independent voters? That's the question. And obviously we'll get that answer in November. It continues tonight where we have another former president who is going to address the convention. And I'm going to bring in Joy Lim Nakrin, who is going to talk about some of the speakers we have that are speaking tonight in Chicago and what we can expect to see and why essentially they are addressing the convention. Joy, it's good to see you again this morning.
Yeah, great to see you, Brendan. And, you know, I really love the context that you provided about the president speaking last night. And, you know, we were talking a little bit yesterday about kind of the effort to kind of distance, you know, the basically as a candidate, Kamala Harris has to, you know, walk a fine line, right? She has to, on one hand, distance herself enough from President Biden to kind of distinguish herself, to kind of present that youthful and fresher face, and really kind of protect herself from attacks by the Trump camp that had really been targeted towards Biden. And you know, on the other hand, obviously, she has this incredible record as the vice president, and that's something that she wants to embrace. But there were some comments that Mr. Biden made last night that really made me recall that conversation that you and I were having about kind of walking this fine line when he said, you know, we're in a battle for the very soul of America, and went on to say, because of you, we've had the most extraordinary 4 years of progress ever. And then he interjected, I say we, I mean me and Kamala. So it kind of underscored this dichotomy and kind of this, I guess, this dance that, you know, that Ms. Harris has to do if she really wants to be successful in defeating the former President Trump. But also interesting to note that a non-politician that really made headlines last night as well, Lil Jon revved up Georgia Democrats.
That's right.
Apparently was headlining an event about 3 miles from the United Center at a trendy nightclub, and apparently was a really good party that went on till 3 o'clock this morning, and brought some new energy, you know, into the Democratic Party, particularly the Georgia camp. And tonight we are expecting former President Obama, Michelle Obama, and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff to speak, and Vice President Harris's campaign has said that they're also going to be spotlighting some trusted messengers, as they call them, from key battleground states over the next few days, and not just tonight, but some of the battleground states that are going to be represented: Nevada with Senator Catherine Cortez Masto. From Michigan, we are expecting Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Senator Gary Peters, and Representative Alyssa Slotkin. Also from Pennsylvania, Senator Bob Casey is expected to speak. And from Wisconsin, Senator Tammy Baldwin. From Arizona, Senator Mark Kelly will speak, along with John Giles, or is it Giles? I apologize. And the Republican mayor who is the Republican mayor of Mesa, I should say. So, you know, they're really making an effort to reach those battleground states and kind of, you know, take a little bit of a grassroots approach in that regard.
And also a famous Georgian and a Republican, Jeff Duncan, the former lieutenant governor, who, you know, needless to say, has been a never-Trumper for some time. He's been very outspoken. He's certainly not the first, former lieutenant governor to address the opposing party's convention. Zell Miller did so back in the early 2000s. So this is not unprecedented, but it's certainly unusual to have a dyed-in-the-wool conservative like Jeff Duncan, who's essentially endorsing Kamala Harris for the presidency.
And I understand he's actually scheduled to speak tomorrow, but really, really noteworthy. We're talking about a Republican speaking for the opposing party. And what he actually told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is, quote, his focus is going to be on the millions of Republicans watching at home that are sick and tired of making excuses for Trump everywhere they go.
And what's interesting is there is an audience for that, particularly in the North Fulton suburbs and the other northern suburbs around Atlanta, where, you know, you have parts of Cobb, parts of North Fulton, parts of Gwinnett that voted for Joe Biden, who had voted for Donald Trump back in 2016. I mean, that is the switchable voter. You know, people keep talking about how Georgia's changing. It's not as though individual Georgians are changing their mind. It's that we've had a dramatic demographic shift that has turned into a democratic shift.
That's right.
Because you don't have, you know, people born in Georgia changing their minds. You have people coming in from other cities that are largely Democratic who are moving here for work because Atlanta's so, growing so fast. And so maybe that is the audience that a Jeff Duncan reaches, is that sort of conservative that feels they don't have a home.
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting point. And it's just an interesting time in politics that Mr. Trump is unlike many other Republicans that we've seen, and we know wasn't always a Republican either. But that people who may be philosophically Republican may not align with the former president in many other ways. So yeah, I mean, I assume that is really the strategy, is to take hold of those folks who maybe have Republican values, but may not be on board with who the former president Trump actually is as a human being.
And while this video is up, I wanted to remark a little bit, because you see the quite literal embrace of Joe Biden's legacy, and also Joe Biden embracing the future, at least of the party, Kamala Harris. And it's a really important image, but at the same time, there's another dichotomy here, which is the record of Joe Biden, which, and this is analysis, not opinion. There's a lot to run on. There's the infrastructure bill. There's, essentially rescuing the economy back from COVID. The issues with, the inflation, which people say inflation's coming down. That doesn't mean prices are coming down. They're still incredibly elevated. Prices generally don't go down unless you have deflation, which is another economic problem. But for the most part, I mean, look at the stock market. It's like tripled in the last 4 years. But the problem is, the dichotomy is that Joe Biden is not a popular president. And this is one of the reasons he's stepped aside. Even the Washington Post in an article this morning said, a losing president had to step aside. And, in the polls, he was, in fact, way behind. Age was a giant factor because part of the problem is it doesn't matter what really is happening. Perception is reality. And the perception you had was Joe Biden, essentially succumbing to Father Time, even though his administration has done excellent work. So you've got the passing of the baton here, the image so important, because this does allow Kamala Harris to say, wait, under our administration, we made all these accomplishments, but guess what? I'm here to tell you that tomorrow is going to be even brighter. It does give them an opportunity to simultaneously run as an insider and an outsider, which is extraordinary. And to bring in you again, Joy, I wanted to say that there's one other thing that's definitely squarely in your wheelhouse, and that is that Kamala Harris is a prosecutor, former attorney general. She quite literally put people behind bars.
Yes.
And then you have her opponent, who is actually facing sentencing on 34 felony counts in New York in just a couple of weeks.
That's right.
A few weeks now.
That's right.
It's extraordinary contrast.
A convicted felon. But, at the same time, Ms. Harris has this record as a prosecutor that has been under attack by the Trump campaign. They've essentially said that she, that she let criminals go, that she was too easy on criminals, as they would say. And, I believe they highlighted a case in which, she, I guess, did not successfully prosecute one defendant and, or her office, shall we say. And according to the Trump camp, that individual went on to commit horrific crimes. And, they really are kind of painting her as a left-wing, left coast Democrat who's too liberal and too soft on criminals, and also too soft on immigration. And that's of course, been a familiar theme that we've heard from the Trump camp in their attacks on Biden, but that certainly is extended to Harris now.
Well, that's so true. And then the other thing about these 34 convictions is, that particular case is the one that appears to, people who support Donald Trump to be the most politically motivated. There's these false allegations that there was some sort of coordination with the Justice Department, while of course all of the prosecutors who were trying to bring, Trump to justice were certainly in communication with each other. It wasn't Joe Biden's Justice Department that told Alvin Bragg to bring this to a grand jury in New York to have it indicted, nor did that jury take instructions from the U.S. Justice Department. But nonetheless, it is seen as politically motivated only because all of these prosecutions were taking place in an election year. And you really can't separate the two. The judges do a good job of it in so much as, you know, they run their trial calendar how they see fit and they don't look at the election calendar. But, you know, how do you square those things when it is happening in an election year? There's a large percentage of Americans, somewhere between 33% and 49%, who see these political or these prosecutions as political and these felony convictions as essentially political as well.
But, you know, on the flip side, you know, I believe it was a Trump-appointed judge who actually dismissed the charges in the Jack Smith prosecution.
That's right.
The federal charges there. And, yeah, so, you know, I guess I don't want to get to editorialize, but certainly there is some political activity in terms of the appointment of judges.
Sure.
With that said, I mean, the judicial branch is an independent branch, right? That's why we have separation of powers, and certainly juries are civilians. I mean, they're not political appointees, you know. So the criminal convictions, I mean, those resulted from a jury. That is what a jury found.
You know, and of course, they're going to argue on the other side of, you know, meaning the Republicans are going to argue, oh, well, that's a Manhattan jury, and Manhattan went overwhelmingly for Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. If this had been moved to another venue like Staten Island, which is Richmond County, you know, a Staten Island jury is overwhelmingly pro-Trump. And so, you know, but one thing you learn when you pass the bar is you don't question the wisdom of a jury, right? You never hear attorneys coming out after a trial and criticizing the jury, and usually not the judge.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, I guess I should add, let's not forget that defense attorneys participate in the jury selection process. They get to exercise strikes. They get to eliminate jurors that they feel are going to be biased against their defendant.
See, there you go with reality again, though, Joy, because reality is irrelevant. It's about perception, right? And so perception, obviously, is that this is political.
Yeah.
And when you have that perception among a plurality or at least a majority of the Republican Party, then, you know, it's very hard to sort of make those arguments. They have the virtue of being true, but as you know, it's just like presenting a case to a jury. You know, it's what the jurors believe, and it's hard to overcome misconceptions, right?
Yeah.
So let's get back to the real quick to one more thing, and this is about Raphael Warnock. Senator Raphael Warnock, another Georgian, obviously, a U.S. Senator from Georgia, addressed the convention last night, and that is getting a lot of traction nationally. You know, not everybody knows Raphael Warnock around the country. We certainly know him here in Georgia and in Atlanta, but there was, you know, sort of an extraordinary performance. You know, remember, he's also a preacher. He is, you know, at Martin Luther King's church, Ebenezer Baptist Church. I mean, this is, you know, he's sort of channeled Martin Luther King Jr. In rallying for Kamala Harris's election last night.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I understand that our Doug Reardon, who has been there throughout the week, or, well, the week's just started, but he is going to be in Chicago at the United Center throughout the week covering the Democratic National Convention, is working on some updates for us. Yeah,
so Doug actually is at present, I may not supposed to say this, but you know what, I'm going to say it anyway. I'm calling an audible. That right now, Doug Reardon is interviewing Senator Raphael Warnock, but right before that, he filed this report.
Day one of the Democratic National Convention wrapped up here in Chicago with a lot of fanfare and a lot of big names. Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State, and also a one-time Democratic nominee for president, got up there and fully endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris for the role that she once held. We also heard from a couple of big names in Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamie Raskin, and Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock. And so it was a big night full of big names, and we're looking forward to a lot of that tonight on day two as well. Former President Barack Obama is going to be tonight's keynote speaker, as his former First Lady and his wife, Michelle Obama. We're also expected to hear from Chicago Governor J.B. Pritzker, who paid a lot of the way for this to come here. Remember, there was a time where we were considering having this in Atlanta, but it ultimately ended up being Pritzker and the city that agreed to pay for a lot of this convention as to being one of the big reasons why they came here. And of course, last night, we also heard from President Joe Biden. It was at once a swan song and a passing of the torch to his Vice President Kamala Harris. He gave a full-throated endorsement of his Vice President and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and said that it was a tough thing for him to do to give up the re-election bid this late into the race. He said, "I love my job, but I love my country more." And just him being here shows that he is okay with this. Going to face a room full of people who told you full on to your face that they did not want you running as their nominee is a very difficult thing to do. Lyndon B. Johnson did not do it when the convention was held here in Chicago in 1956. He forewent coming here, and so Biden being here in very much the same circumstances really shows just how okay with this he actually is. On top of the fact that some of those names I listed earlier, a lot of high-profile Democrats are rallying behind Biden. It shows that there is a coalition, that there is cohesion in this party, and that everyone is on board and trying to ride that momentum. Again, though, that could be a good thing or a bad thing for the Democrats because you want change, right? Voters, especially younger voters, have told us here at the convention that they are excited for a new candidate, a new era in the Democratic Party. And so while it is certainly nice to have a lot of big names, a lot of big surrogates here, I think people are looking for a changing of the guard. And certainly that is what we are kind of feeling on the precipice of here in Chicago. And so, again, we are going to be paying very close attention night two tonight to some of the speakers, what they have to say, trying to keep that momentum going into day three. And, of course, we'll be here for all of it. We're in Chicago. Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
All right. Thank you so much, Doug. It's so good to have you there for Atlanta News First. Atlanta News First sent Doug Reardon to Milwaukee for the Republican convention. He's now there at the Democratic convention. I saw his time card. I think he worked like 100 hours, and that may have been actually just the OT that he worked. That's how much he worked in Milwaukee. He's doing the same here now. I mean, they're working morning, noon, and night. I'm a veteran of multiple conventions and campaigns and traveling on the road, and I can tell you it is exhausting. There was a saying on the campaign trail amongst correspondents and journalists, "I'll sleep when I die," is what they would say. There's very little sleep going on for Doug Reardon this weekend. And then he got thrown right into storm coverage, I think, right after that. So, he's a champion for Atlanta News First, and he's out there right now interviewing Senator Raphael Warnock. But he did, Doug, file a report last night for us that we can replay now. What it's going to show you is sort of a recap of what happened last night at the convention. We'll take a look at that, and then we'll talk about what's coming up tonight in Chicago.
Democratic delegates are excited. There really wasn't a whole lot of dissent among them when that big switch was made from President Joe Biden to Vice President Kamala Harris. It came just a few weeks after that disastrous debate performance in Atlanta. And we got a chance to talk to some of them on the ground here in Chicago. The roll call vote for those delegates is scheduled for tomorrow. That's going to be mostly for show, though, as these delegates already took virtual roll calls to confirm Harris as the nominee and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as a running mate. Even some of the ticket's youngest supporters, like Georgia delegate Nico Parra, who is from Gwinnett County and just 20 years old, he's going to be voting in his first presidential election this year, are feeling good about the ticket.
I am excited. I really am excited. The fact is that this is my very first Democratic convention ever. This is actually the first presidential race that I'm eligible to vote in. And so for me, the fact is that I'm voting in a historic candidate is amazing. It's a fact that's not lost on me, right? As well as it's not lost on many of my other peers who are also representing the young Democrats of Georgia.
And good news for Harris coming into this convention. For the first time, new polling shows that she is ahead of Donald Trump nationally by a very slim margin. From the United Center in Chicago, Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
And thanks again, Atlanta News First reporter, political reporter Doug Reardon, for that report from Chicago. Doug will be reporting throughout the convention, including tonight on Atlanta News First programming. He'll have reports actually in the noon and at 4 o'clock and throughout all the way up until 11 o'clock. And then it starts all over again for him first thing in the morning. Again, no sleep for Doug Reardon this week at the Democratic National Convention. There is a lot of talk right now about Kamala Harris as being the second female, the second woman at the top of a major party ticket running for president. Of course, the first was Hillary Clinton, but she is by far not the first woman to run for president. In fact, the first female presidential candidate in the United States was 150 years ago. So it has happened again and again, but obviously that glass ceiling, as Hillary Clinton said so famously in 2016, may not be broken, but it has 1,000 cracks in it, to paraphrase what she said back in 2016. We have yet to have, obviously, a woman president in the United States. There is a chance that that is going to change for the first time in U.S. history. You also have a number of other firsts that Kamala Harris herself is not so much talking about, but everyone else is, including the opposing party, including her racial background. She is black and she is also Indian, South Asian. So you have, sort of an example of America as a melting pot. America was built by immigrants. There were Native Americans here, and of course there's a long and bloody history of invasion by Europeans. And then you had people coming from all over the world following the beacon of freedom. It is a complicated history in the United States, but it is one that we embrace in terms of trying to always look to our better angels, as so many have said before. But this is an opportunity for the United States, obviously, to elect the first female president. It'll be the first South Asian president, not the first black president. That, of course, would be Barack Obama, who himself was also half black, half Caucasian. He was elected in 2008, and he will be speaking tonight at the convention. And this is a big moment, even though they've known each other for 20 years, Barack Obama and Kamala Harris, and they've been friends and supported each other. In fact, you have to go all the way back to when Kamala Harris was actually a delegate at the convention where Barack Obama spoke, and that speech that he gave was considered the beginning of his national political career. It launched him into the presidency. One could argue his speech at the Democratic National Convention, and at that point Kamala Harris was a delegate, and now here she is about to accept the nomination for to be president of the United States, the nomination from the Democratic National Convention and the National Party, which is an extraordinary ascension, not unlike the one that Barack Obama had, and realized that Barack Obama had not originally sort of jumped on the Kamala Harris bandwagon in those tumultuous 48 hours right after Joe Biden announces he's stepping down. There was sort of a clamoring. Was there going to be like a snap primary? Was there going to be an open convention? In fact, Barack Obama was pushing for one of those two options. He did not want to anoint a candidate, and in part because they didn't want it to look like that the party bosses were picking the nominee. That's actually how the nominees were picked for most of the history of the Democratic Party. Same thing with the Republican Party. It used to be that the power brokers within the party would actually pick the nominee, and then they would have the support at the convention with a floor vote and all of that kind of thing to become the nominee. We don't do it that way anymore, or at least we didn't, because we would have the primary system. And even though we think of the primary system as some sort of official government election of the nominee, it's really just the apparatus of the election system used to inform the private political parties. Because remember, they're corporations, essentially, the Republicans and the Democrats. They're private political parties. They're not in the Constitution. They're not part of the official sort of legal political system within the United States, but they certainly are part of the political system itself. They're so dominant that the parties, as I said yesterday, are able to actually just tell most of the states who their nominee is, and they're automatically on the ballot, which is extraordinary. So before we depart for the day and send you off to day 2 of the Democratic National Convention and our new newscast later on, we do want to take a look again at what the national media, the CBS News, is covering at the convention, so you can see what's happened so far to inform what happens next.
Democratic delegates are excited. There really wasn't a whole lot of dissent among them when that big switch was made from President Joe Biden to Vice President Kamala Harris. It came just a few weeks after that disastrous debate performance in Atlanta. And we got a chance to talk to some of them on the ground here in Chicago. The roll call vote for those delegates is scheduled for tomorrow. That's going to be mostly for show, though, as these delegates are...
Yeah, so we're back. Sorry. You know what? We love Atlanta News First political reporter Doug Reardon so much. We wanted you to hear his report a second time. No, this is live streaming, folks. What we're going to do is we're going to queue up that CBS report so you can do that recap of last night. But while we're waiting for that, let's talk a little bit about the challenges that lie ahead. You know, realize what an extraordinary time we are in, where you have a former president of the United States, Donald Trump, who just survived an assassination attempt literally hours before his convention. Someone who was defeated in the last election is now the nominee to run in this election. Someone who gave a speech prior to his supporters storming the U.S. Capitol while they were counting the electoral votes. Someone who is still facing the potential of prosecution for his actions on that day, January 6th. Someone who is awaiting sentencing on 34 felony counts and prosecution, including here in Fulton County, going forward, which will be on hold if he's elected president, even though, and this is kind of an important point, while the president can pardon quite literally himself, we know the pardon power is now essentially unlimited because the president has been given immunity by the U.S. Supreme Court for all official acts. So you could have a president pardon him or herself for all crimes federally, not state crimes. So the Fulton County case, the case in Manhattan, those cannot be sort of washed away or batted away with a pardon, but they can be delayed. It's almost impossible to try a sitting U.S. president on criminal charges while they're in office. So you'd have to wait until Donald Trump, if elected, is out of office, and by then he'd be 83 years old, 83, 84 years old, which is pretty extraordinary to think, of that possibility. Now, on the other side, since we're talking about the Democratic National Convention, you have a nominee who's been the nominee for barely a month, walking up to the convention. Again, this is the way things used to be done. Back the last convention in Chicago, they didn't have a nominee going into the convention. There were people actually joining the race up until the very last week before the convention, and then the nominee was decided at the convention with riots outside and near riots inside even, which is hard to believe. So we're in a different time now, though, where Kamala Harris became the nominee and very, very recently. She wasn't even the presumptive nominee until the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And you have the sitting president of the United States deciding not to run for re-election for only the second time in the last 56 years. The other one was LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, who dropped out of the race, and that was in March of 1968, the last time the convention was in Chicago. So again, as I said yesterday, history doesn't repeat, but history does rhyme, and we're certainly seeing that. But what an extraordinary time we're in. I've seen some social media posts saying, I long to live in precedented times, because we do live in these unprecedented times where just imagine that we had an assassination attempt on a former president now running for president, and then we had the sitting president drop out and his vice president jump in, and now you have the race flipped, essentially, where Donald Trump was leading in all the polls for months and was widely expected by independent political pundits to essentially walk away with the presidency, to where now we have a competitive race with Kamala Harris leading within the margins of error nationally and in some of the swing states. So if anybody tells you what's going to happen in November or between now and then, don't believe them, because nobody knows, including this reporter right here. But Atlanta News First is on top of it. We're going to be following the Democratic National Convention all day. I can tell you that CBS coverage tonight starts an hour early. It's going to start at 9 o'clock, the network coverage in prime time instead of 10 o'clock. You may remember that last night, Eastern Daylight Time, Joe Biden took the stage at 11:27 p.m., 10:27 p.m. in Chicago. But we are going to have live coverage here throughout the day, here both streaming on Atlanta News First Plus and also on Atlanta News First starting just a little bit from now in 26 minutes on Atlanta News First at noon. So for now, I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates. We'll see you next time for more coverage of the Democratic National Convention.